I'm just really excited to talk with Grant. I think, architecture traditionally was just about space, and the pandemic, it was all about people changes. And I think, his firm, architecture, has slowly evolved to really marry space with people, and, things are ever changing. So I think it'll be really exciting to kind of have Grant walk us through kind of the past, present, and future of, architecture and how it's come to really overcome, and tackle workplace. So Grant, do you want to start and just tell us about yourself, your background? You've been with MMoser for 7 years. What was your journey like, and now leading up to this workplace role?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Jing. Really appreciate it. Actually, I was educated as an interior designer, and really went into this industry sort of with a lot of dreams and hopes of what workplace and what environments in general could be and how they could shape our behavior. I spent about 5 years practicing design, and realized that actually a lot of the decisions that we make in our environments, a lot of the ways that we design and craft our environments is a lot of times arbitrary. A lot of the decisions are based on practices from 10, 15, 20, 25, and even longer years ago. And I just wanted more out of it. And so actually, I was going to leave the industry because I was kind of fed up with it and just didn't really feel like it was the right fit for me. And a friend of mine said, there's this thing called workplace strategy. It's an emerging industry. You may want to try that out, see how that works out for you. And so I was lucky enough to join MMoser Associates, where I currently am the director of workplace strategy. But when I joined, I didn't know anything about workplace strategy, and they, kind of took me into their group and taught me the ropes. And I learned a lot along the way. I've explored a lot, and worked with a lot of really amazing clients over the last 7 years, helping them to understand how their business performance and their business objectives relate to their workplace environment, and how we can use those environments to craft better businesses and better work experiences.
So working with your clients, how would you say your perspective is different from, HR's perspective or the finance real estate team? And an interesting thing as workplace has become a bigger role, a bigger function. Some workplace teams report to head of real estate, some report to CFO, some report to the COO, and they each look at the business differently, right? And that, I'm sure, complicates what the goals are, what you're solving for. And so, you guys adding to the mix, how is your perspective different? How do you navigate these different goals?
Yeah, so every group that you mentioned, HR, technology, workplace, real estate, the businesses themselves, right? The functional groups of an organization, they all have objectives, right? And everybody's objective is what I would consider two things. One is, a business exists to create profit and enable an economy which we live in, right? That's sort of the meta objective of a business. And then a secondary objective, which is still pretty high level, is making sure that the experience and the just simple needs of employees and the people who work in an organization are being met, right? If we think about employee experience, we define it, or we can define it as the balance between organizational needs and employee needs, right? How do we balance those two things to get the best outcomes? And so when HR is in the mix, right, they're solely focused on people, right? They're focused on things like benefits and experiences that they can create, and salary and compensation and safety and things that have to do with the human experience. When we come into the mix, we care about that, right? Because we simply we only exist to help businesses perform their best, right? There's no point in doing the work that we do unless you're trying to make businesses perform their best. But the angle and the lens which we come at it is from creating those experiences or facilitating those experiences in the built environment, right? So fundamentally, we have to understand a lot of the same things that an HR team or a people team have to understand: how performance happens, how people connect, what the objectives of the organization are, how people are healthy and safe. We have to understand all of these things But we have to understand it not through the lens of policies we could create or benefits we could offer, but through environments we could craft and tools that we can create that will support people to do those things and to have those experiences.
And what about the, the CFO or the COO? Well, I think one big topic I saw on LinkedIn was, now CFOs are happy for remote work to be another way to simply cut costs, right? To downsize the office, to, there's a lot of layoffs happening and the recession being talked about. So what happens if if there's a disconnect between what the head of HR or head of people or the CFO wants, and how do you address that?
There's almost always a disconnect, because the motivations tend to be, and I won't say in every organization, there are many organizations where this is not the case, but the motivations for these groups tend to be siloed and separate, right? Often real estate is housed under the CFO, right? And traditionally, real estate was thought of as just a cost, right? We have to pay this, it's sunken cost, and we just have to deal with it. Let's make it as minimal as humanly possible, right? Without thinking about the added value that it could add it back into the business by supporting people in the right way. And so many organizations are starting to think in that way and shift the dynamic and move real estate under HR. But what happens is then you actually start losing a little bit of that insight to cost, right? Are we spending money in the right way? Is money being spent at a cadence that aligns to the fiduciary responsibility that this organization has? So there is definitely a balance to be had. I think if we're talking about kind of trend across organizations, HR teams right now are really trying to create the best experience. So they don't really necessarily care if, they're not thinking too much about, is it in person or is it remote? They're thinking about how can we bolster that experience no matter where you are. CFOs, yeah, they are trying to reduce costs, right? Especially now as the economy is changing shape. They're trying to reduce costs wherever they can without, laying people off is probably the worst thing that we can do, right, inside of our organization.
Resort,
so what are the things we can do before we do that? And then, when we think about other teams, right, like CTOs, again, I don't think, or it hasn't been my experience necessarily, that they're really focused on the workplace. What I have found is that some of them are focused on innovation. And when they see the workplace as the center of innovation, that's when they're focused on workplace, right? As like a facilitator for their objectives, which also brings me to business leaders. Business leaders, I think, are the most tuned into workplace, because a lot of them see it as, again, that place where innovation happens, where connection happens, those serendipitous moments. So actually at the CEO level or the COO level, that's where we have the most attention right now. They're really switched on right now to, how am I using my real estate to improve what we do and create better outcomes?
So the pandemic must have been really fun for you guys, right? every quarter, every new variant, I can't imagine. It's been really difficult. Did you start sorting your, you were talking about the CEO, the business leader. Did you put them in buckets of, this is the remote first CEO bucket, this is the, everybody back to the office CEO bucket there? And do you know how your clients are leaning, and then therefore you can then choose like a certain strategy for them?
That's actually really interesting. So when we're talking to our clients initially, we want to understand everyone's motivations, but actually we try to do the opposite thing. We actually try to bring everybody together, because really, workplace impacts everybody, and having success actually means that everyone's bought into it. So oftentimes what we do, and it's actually a little crazy that we do this, or that we're in the position to do this, we're the facilitators of organizations at even the highest levels coming together to have a conversation about what the future of their business looks like, right? And sometimes that's through a conversation about workplace or real estate. Sometimes it's truly a conversation. I mean, oftentimes the initial conversations we're having with clients are, what do you see as the future of your business? How should people behave? What will drive performance for you? And again, those are things that we need to understand so that we can develop, environments or portfolios of environments that will enable that. So a
That's
little bit of the
amazing.
opposite of siloing them out.
Yeah, that's amazing because I don't think architecture was having those kind of discussions like 20 years ago, right? Even 10 years
No,
ago. It's
no,
very
no, it's very different. And because it has become so much of workplace has become so much about business performance, it's become about experiences. And even at just a very cosmetic level, it has become about creating a brand for attracting clients, about attracting new talent, right? Especially for certain industries, that's hugely important. So even at the very, very cosmetic level, it's hugely important to understand how that attributes to being on top.
Danielle says, how are you measuring success with client real estate portfolios? And is that different from how success has been measured in the past?
Mm.
Great
Yeah,
question.
that's a really good question. So we actually, during the pandemic, we started to think to ourselves, actually, the way we've been measuring success in the past, which in terms of real estate is typically in metrics like square foot per person, utilization, right? So if just utilization is how many people fill the space, right? If you have a certain number of seats, how many of those seats are being taken? These are metrics that measured very sort of cut and dry metrics that said the space was being used and it was being used effectively, right? If your goal is to make sure that your costs are as low as humanly possible for the amount of people you have, right? But what many organizations faced during the pandemic was first their work styles and their work programs changed to be more hybrid, right? I think most organizations have some form of hybrid now, which meant that you no longer could expect that 100%, or there was never 100%, but a version of 100% of people would show up every day. So that's number one, that you couldn't ever expect that anymore, which meant that you had to understand how many people would show up every day. The other thing is that people weren't showing up necessarily to show up, which they did in the past, right? We were all told we had to show up 5 days a week, so we showed up. It didn't really matter why we were going, whether we hated it or not, we went, right? Because that was going to work.
Yeah, because it was
Now,
more like going to school. Like you just
right,
don't question if you
you just
cannot
go.
go.
Right, you just go. And so we changed that dynamic too and said, actually, there's a choice, and the choice is go for some intentional purpose, right? In some organizations, that is. So we had to actually start thinking about how we measured real estate differently. So we started creating metrics like experience square foot per person, which means if I have a certain amount of square footage, right? I have a certain real estate portfolio, or even just a singular space, and it's designed for a certain number of people, but that number of people doesn't show up every day. What as a singular employee that does show up, what can I experience? How much space do I actually have to use, right? How can I, like, what is my experience as an employee in a space? Now, you might be thinking, well, that seems kind of arbitrary because it could change every day, and that's absolutely true. But actually, what we're trying to understand is if you have 100,000 square feet for, let's say, 1,000 people, but only 20 people show up every day, that's a pretty terrible experience, right? It's a ghost town, right? And the reverse could be true, right? If you have too little space for too many people, that could also be a terrible experience, right? There's too many people. So trying to understand what people are experiencing and putting metrics to that. Other metrics are things like how many unique work points per person are available to each person in a space, right? So when I show up to work, is my only option to sit at a desk? And if so, is that really worth it? Was it worth the commute to the office to yet again sit at another desk
Wait, can
that I
you
could have sat
explain
at?
what a work point is? And
Oh,
what are the
sorry about
different?
that. So what we would consider a work point is anywhere that you could ergonomically sit and effectively do your job. Assuming that you're a knowledge worker, right? Working on a laptop or working on a computer. So you can have a variety of different types of settings in a workplace that could meet different comfort needs, different privacy needs, different, collaboration needs. So if you have access to a lot of different or a variety of different work points, we see that for most organizations as being a benefit, right? There's an incentive to come, and also it actually could enable you in different ways to do your job better. So those are a couple. I mean, we have a whole list that we created during the pandemic to say we actually need to think about and measure space completely differently than we used to in the past, because actually the objective isn't filling the space anymore, it's creating positive experiences inside of the space.
Yeah, I remember a report from, I think I saw 2 or 3 years ago, saying that even by generation, like Gen Z prefers to not sit in one place versus millennials and older generations. We joined the workforce when we had our cubicle, that's your space, like that's it, and other than that, maybe the cafeteria. And Gen Z coming in, if they want to sit on the couch, if they want to sit by the window, just the expectations are very different depending on when you've joined the workforce.
That's really interesting. So and when we do change management, we actually see this manifestation through actually people's not ability to learn, but their resistance or hesitancy to learn the different, a new way of working, I should say. When you have older generations, let's say even boomers who are still in the workplace, they tend to be really hesitant to even acknowledge that they could learn, that there is something new, right? Like it's almost like how boomers treat technology, right? They're sort of like, I'm not going to press any buttons because I'm going to screw it up, right? Like there's just no way I'm going to be able to figure this out. When you get closer to, let's say, X or millennials, there's a really strong desire to adopt, but not like not like a need, right? So I squarely fit into the millennial generation. I'm like, oh yeah, I could figure it out, but I don't really care if I do or not, right? Like it's not a need. When we look at Z or even really young millennials, there's a really strong resistance to, don't tell me where to sit, right? Like I have to choose where I sit because, like I'm a unique person in the world, and, like I'm used to having all of the choice at my fingertips, right? Which also overwhelms them, by the way, but we'll leave that for a different conversation. But so you see this really wide range when we're doing change management of like change adoption curve being so drastically different. But then at the end of the day, actually, most people end up embracing, like in the workplace I work in, we have people all the way from boomers to really young, even Gen Z. And everybody uses kind of every space. And it's fascinating to see that actually people's work styles don't really correspond to their generation. It's more just that their quickness to adopt is what is different.
Yeah. In support of Gen Z, I think lately, like in the last couple of years, personally, I've become just more aware. And I think culturally, just all the things we talk about on LinkedIn, there's just different types of work, right? So sometimes you need one set of place and setup environment for like deep work, quiet work, versus you need another totally different space for calls and social work, and then group collaboration. So I feel like before, the spaces weren't necessarily divided that way based on the type of work. Everyone just had their own, like you said, utilization of your own like 8x8.
Right.
So,
and why would you come into work if you have the choice to come into work? Why would you come into work to be in that 8x8 unless there was a reason? We call it
to escape your home.
Place or space motivated. So if you're space motivated, you're leaving your house to go seek another space. If you're place motivated, you're leaving your house or you're leaving your wherever you work normally to go to a place where a destination, right? A place you'll feel a sense of community, you'll meet people, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that could change per person per day, right? Sometimes I just want to get out of my apartment, and sometimes I love just being with my colleagues and like hanging around them. So that does also change day to day, and the spaces you use, depending on if you're place or space motivated, will change as well, right?
Interesting. I have not heard that term before. Space motivated, place motivated. And
Uh,
everyone feel free to ask your question in the chat or just feel free to unmute and jump in so we can have a group chat for a few minutes and then we'll go into our one-on-one networking. So you had talked about, clients and talent, it's really important to attract them. So like pre-pandemic, I feel like the peak of the coolest office is like having the ping pong table, the open kitchen, maybe a keg if you're tech. So like 21, 22, like during the pandemic, what are some, a lot of changes, a lot of, fears and back and forth, but like, what are kind of things as things settle down, what are some things that are arising as like the new takeaways and tips? And
yeah, that's also a really good question. So I will say that in no way was I happy about a global pandemic, but the little bit of push that it did to workplace was to get people out of the mindset that ping pong tables and cafes and free food were like meant culture or meant a good workplace, which was definitely the mindset prior to the pandemic. It was sort of like, what is the model? What is the Google model, and how do we create it? How do we recreate it for ourselves? And it led to a lot of, I think, poor decision making, frankly, in real estate. So when the pandemic hit and people sort of had this little bit of a reset of, wait a minute, that wasn't worth our money, it wasn't worth our time, and it doesn't align to our cultural values, right? It doesn't align to who we are as an organization or how we operate. Um, when that happened, I think organizations started thinking about what actually is meaningful to us. What will drive performance for our people if and when they can come back together. So in 2020 and 2021, people couldn't come together. So there was a lot of time to think about that and to talk about it. And we did do a lot of thinking and talking. And now that we're out of that, what we're seeing, a few of the things that we're seeing that are sort of, I despise the word trends, but I'm going to use it in this context, trends that we're seeing arise. One is the sort of on-site, off-site. This is a space or an environment that enables teams to come together that maybe they come in infrequently, or maybe they live all over the world or the country, but it allows them to come together and have focused time together. It probably has a variety of spaces, probably is close to food or some sort of other amenity, but it's focused. It's really, there's usually no desks or workstations, I should say. It's all about collaboration together time. We're seeing also, I'll say, a trend towards the hybrid meeting room, right? And if I had to point to one that worked, I wouldn't be able to, but I think it's still top of mind for everybody and still certainly top of mind for our clients. This is an environment that creates a quality in the experience for both virtual and in-person attendees. And then as a third, I would say a prioritization of we spaces or social spaces and collaborative spaces over individual spaces. And this one is really about composition and how you use real estate. So a lot of organizations reduced their footprint over the pandemic. I won't say all, but a lot of them did, either drastically or slightly. And so when they're looking at what's remaining, they're seeing a huge amount of their space being used for individual, workstations or private offices. And they're saying, is that really why we want people to come in? Is that really why we want to be paying, in New York, $150 a square foot in rent in a premier building in the city? No, that's not actually why we want to pay for that money. We want to pay so that we can drive innovation, drive connectedness, and the workstation and private office are just not going to cut it, right? Like they're not going to do it. So we're seeing not all organizations, but a lot of organizations trend towards more collaborative space, trend towards more social and amenity space, so that they can purposefully bring people together and not pay. I was working with one organization that was paying $15,000 or $20,000 every single time they wanted to do an all hands to do it at a hotel because they didn't have the space in their own facility. And they said, why would we pay that? We could just repurpose our space. We could just have that in our own portfolio, right? So it's that kind of thinking that's happening.
This has been absolutely fascinating. I think we all learned so much from you. I think we're now thinking about space and people and how to the Venn diagram of how they really come together totally differently. I think with way more clarity than before. So thank you so much, Grant, for sharing
Absolutely.
those
Thank you for
insights
having
and
me.
thought leadership. So